IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this all new episode of All Things Policy. Today we have Manoj with us after a very long time. First of all, welcome Manoj.
Hey, thanks, Suyash.
Yes, and as you know, when Manoj and I are talking, we are always discussing China. So we are going to discuss the NPC session, which is also known to be China's parliament, which is ongoing right now. If I'm not wrong, Manoj, this is ongoing and this is happening till this Thursday, right? It's a whole week of NPC session when thousands of delegates from different corners of China are coming to Beijing to attend the ongoing parliament.
Yeah, hi Suyash. So this is like an annual event. It's called the two sessions. So you basically have these two bodies, which one of which is the NPC, which is the National People's Congress, which is China's parliament, which meets once a year to talk about different laws and to also talk about clear different laws, of course, to put out the annual budgets for local and central government and to also sort of clear out the agenda for the year. The big highlight every year is that the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang right now delivers sort of like the annual State of the Union address where he talks about what was done in the past year and outlines developmental objectives and sort of broad policy objectives for the coming year. This is one of the best times to try and understand what are the government's priorities, what are the party's priorities. And like you said, the lawmakers in China are called NPC deputies or delegates, and there are just about 3,000 of them, a little under 3,000 of them, picked from different places. Process by which these people become NPC deputies is also not necessarily a clear-cut process. There's a slightly murky process by which people become deputies. But the NPC is the body which is your sort of final legislative authority. Like I said, it meets once a year, but it operates throughout the year through its standing committee. And the standing committee meets bi-monthly basis. And that's when you get different legislation discussed and cleared, and they eventually get passed. So like last year, we had the Hong Kong National Security Law, which was cleared, and it was done in record time by the NPC Standing Committee. So there are different processes that take place. The other body for which this is called the two sessions is the CPPCC. That's a consultative body. It's a much larger group of people, and it has people from different walks of life. So you'd have people from culture, education, sports, industry, and so on. They are also sort of deputies, and what they do is essentially that they provide proposals for lawmakers to consider. So this is your body through which you're deliberating with different people in society and different social groups and different economic groups. And you take inputs from them on your legislation and on policies, and they sort of provide you that sort of process of inputs. This is what the Chinese will eventually call their sort of deliberative democracy, where they are taking inputs and they are taking feedback from different walks of life, people from different walks of life, to be able to arrive at decisions. Of course, when you look at it from the outside, what you see is that unlike how we see parliamentary functions, whether it's in the US Congress, whether it's in the Indian Parliament, what you will see is that there's a lot of debate and discussion. There's lots of downvoting of legislation and those sorts of things. You don't really see that in the Chinese Parliament. What you actually see is essentially whatever is put on the table eventually gets approved. You don't see things getting disapproved. And in fact, I think the good folks at Macro Polo have done a data-bound thing where they talk about how increasingly under Xi Jinping, you have higher approval rates from the NPC, which tells you that there is greater elite support for his agenda.
Okay. Before we go on to what is happening currently under this year's NPC, could you briefly tell us what is Party Congress? How is Party Congress different from NPC? What is under the party? What is under the government? And what are other major institutions that we should focus alongside NPC
Sure.
while watching China?
Sure. So one thing to differentiate is that this is the NPC is part of the state system, right? It's an organ of the state, whereas the party is separate. The party also has its party congress that is held once in 5 years. that has to do with people who belonging to the Communist Party of China. The NPC is much broader. It has not just people, it's dominated by people from the Communist Party of China, but China also has other parties which essentially play a secondary role. They don't play a political role per se, but members of those parties are represented in the NPC along with other sort of groups. So the NPC is a state body, whereas the Communist Party's Congress, which is held once in 5 years, is different. That party congress, apart from being held once in 5 years, every year you have plenary sessions, and those plenary sessions have specific focus. So far under the 19th party congress, which was held in October 2017, you had 5 different plenary sessions. Some were very, very short, some were longer, and some had specific focus, such as one was on the economy, one was on national governance, the last one was on national governance, and so on and so forth. So I think you have different focus for different plenary sessions, and those plenary sessions essentially outline your agenda for different areas and for the year. The NPC, the National People's Congress, is your parliament. And this is sort of replicated at different levels. Just like in India, you have the Lok Sabha, and then you have Vidhan Sabha at different levels, and then you have municipal governance. In China, what you have is you've got the NPC at the central level, which is the People's Congress, and then you have provincial People's Congresses, which is local level legislatures at provincial levels, and then subsequently sort of going down. So that People's Congress system then sort of percolates down. This is distinct and runs in parallel to the party Congress system. The party Congress system is completely different, and its objectives are completely different. The party is not passing laws. The party is dealing with internal governance, internal constitution, internal elections, and those sorts of things, and internal priorities, which eventually become state priorities because it's a party state model. But yeah, those are two distinct things that if you want to follow to try and understand as to what's happening.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thanks for that explanation, Manoj. Moving on, so every year, China's premier presents a work report regarding what has been done and what are the priorities in future. Li Keqiang this year also presented a work report in which he had briefly highlighted what is economy going to be, what are their agendas for eradication of poverty, how is defense structure going to be look into 2021. So could you briefly tell us what were the major highlights from Li Keqiang's work report this year?
Yeah, sure. So this is the sort of routine task, right? The premier routinely, because the premier essentially heads the government in that sense, right? He's the executive chief, although the president is the head of the state, but the premier is essentially running the show in terms of the government. Of course, again, the premier is also number 2 in the party and Xi Jinping is number 1 in the party. So Xi Jinping essentially runs the show. But Li Keqiang, the premier's job traditionally has been to manage the economy. So Li Keqiang, for the last several years, ever since he's been premier, has been presenting this annual report. Last year, this happened in May because of COVID. Otherwise, it always happens in March. This year, what he did was that, it's pretty standard format of what the work report is like, right? He usually talks about what was achieved in the previous year, and that's sort of measured against developmental targets that were outlined. And there are broad goals that are talked about. So this time he talks about, of course, the fact that China achieved a major strategic success in its response to COVID-19, the fact that it was able to contain COVID-19. He spoke about the fact that 2020 was the year when absolute poverty had to be alleviated, and that goal was achieved. Again, these are political goals. When you said, usually when politicians set a certain target, you're able to meet that target by and large, and particularly in the Chinese system, you will always meet the target. It's never like you're never going to meet the target. That just tells you a little bit about how counting and numbers are sort of narrative tools. The third, obviously, big thing was that was linked to building this moderately prosperous society, the idea of doubling China's GDP from 2010 to 2020, and that by and large was achieved. So he talked about that and talked about how there is tremendous amount of confidence going forward. This was also an interesting sort of year for this speech because it is the end of the 13th five-year plan. The Chinese leadership is putting together the 14th five-year plan. The details of that are still not entirely out, but that's your next plan for the next 5 years. So Li Keqiang also sort of gave you a bit of a recap of what they achieved in the last 5 years. Some of the sort of key things that he spoke about over the last 1 year was that, and this is again targets that were outlined in the previous year. So he talked about how we maintained stability in the 6 key areas of, providing job security, meeting basic living needs, operations of market entities. We were able to maintain overall stability and therefore deliver progress. He talked about how 11.86 million urban jobs were added through the year, which is again above the target that was set, and critical from the point of view of how employment last year, when you think of COVID and the fact that there was an economic shock, there were job cuts, companies were laying off people. how the government sort of stepped in to support, to ensure that people were not laid off, and to, cut burdens on enterprises. So therefore, he talks about, how we reduced burdens on market entities by more than 2.6 trillion yuan, including 1.7 trillion yuan in social insurance premium cuts and exemptions. This is essentially your sort of employer's contribution to employee funds. So how you eased burden on enterprises so that they can keep people on payrolls. And that was critical for the government, because if you saw unemployment zooming up, that would lead to other social stability issues from a Chinese point of view. So he talks about that quite significantly. Then he talks about, how he gives you a glimpse into what the 14th five-year plan is going to be like, right? And he talks about how you need to focus on development, which is one of the key sort of foundation issues, which is an interesting statement that he makes, because it tells you a little bit about how the party views its own legitimacy, that development is critical. He talks about how, you want to make sure that the GDP continues to grow faster. You want to keep sure that urban unemployment rate remains within 5.5%, and generally you keep prices stable. Again, these are really, really critical targets. He also spoke about how he wants to set a GDP target for this year, which is, again, they set a GDP target for 2021-2022 at 6%. Last year, you did not have a GDP target. Part of that was due to COVID, but also part of that is because from 2017 onwards, there has been an effort by the party to move away from setting GDP targets. And that's part of Xi Jinping's policy of moving away from high growth or fast growth to high quality growth, which was his sort of key mantra that came out of the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And the idea there was that, because you are setting these targets for GDP growth, local governments are trying to reach those targets. Those targets are essentially metrics that will feed into the local officials' promotions. And because of that, what happens is that there's lots of wasteful investment, because GDP is being boosted up by investment as opposed to focusing on quality and productivity of investment. And that leads to then things like ghost towns and wasted investment and things like that. And you want to move away from that to a different metric of growth, where you're looking at things like, say, environmental degradation and things like that, to provide higher quality life for people, which is what Xi Jinping's principal contradiction shift was in 2017. So what this tells you is that if you're going back to setting growth targets and trying to achieve those growth targets, it means that you're moving away from what you wanted to actually do. And that's an important point to keep in mind. He then spoke about, of course, there was a significant amount of focus on scientific and technological capabilities. I think this is something that, will increasingly get paid more attention to going forward. We've been hearing for the last couple of years, the Chinese leadership realizing that they need to focus on innovation and technological capability, particularly given the tech war with the US. The fact that China imports about $300 billion worth of semiconductors, and pressure from the US on that is something that they see as something that can create strategic imperatives for China. So I think it's important that you've heard him talk about how he wants to expand China's R&D budget by 7% every year over the next 5 years. That's a significant increase, over the next 5 years. He also spoke about how, you want to focus on core technologies, expanding to the country's research base. This is again something that's really, really important, because that's where China feels that significantly you're going to see the challenges of the future going to come into play. And he talks about, if you read, Li Keqiang doesn't talk about this, but it's important to read this speech along with a document that was released by the country's top planner, which is the National Development and Reform Commission. The document is called a report on the implementation of the 2020 Plan for National Economic and Social Development and a draft plan for 2021. And in that, it identifies key segments and key areas. So it talks about, how nationwide R&D spending has reached 2.4% of GDP, and the contribution made by advances in science and technology is estimated to account for about 60.2% of economic growth, and how now the focus is going to be on more national laboratories, accelerated deployment of major projects, what these major investments that are going to be in terms of 5G, quantum computing, AI, brain science, and so on and so forth. And that's the focus going forward. Focus on core research, focus on these things, focus on building new types of infrastructure, which is something that Li Keqiang has spoken about in 2020 also, which is a huge stimulus that you're giving. Again, investment-driven growth through focusing on new infrastructure. So you'll be building 5G networks, you'll be building data centers, you'll be building the industrial internet, and through that you're going to power future growth. So it's an investment in tremendous amount of new infrastructure, which is going to power future growth. At the same time, Li Keqiang also spoke about major projects, right? This is again something that they spoke about last year. What do these major projects mean? This is a lot of traditional infrastructure. So roadways, railways, highways, waterways, water conservancy projects, energy projects. And in his speech this year, Li Keqiang pledged more money for these projects. Interestingly, there is a reduction in the amount of money that is pledged for local governments in terms of local government, bond that they can demand. And that's something that sort of people have noted, that there is going to be a stimulus that's going to continue, but it's going to be reduced. So Li Keqiang said that there are going to be no special COVID-19 bonds that will be issued this year. Last year, there were 2 trillion worth of bonds that were issued. But there are going to be local government special purpose bonds worth 3.65 trillion. This is a little bit less than last year. Last year, I think it was about 3.75, 3.8 trillion. So there's a little bit of a pullback. And he's also said that the scope of the use of such bonds will be expanded as he deemed appropriate, but the priority is for existing funding projects which are already under construction. So you're going to probably see going forward fewer projects being approved, but yet there is going to be investment driven growth. So the top line growth number will remain high because the central government is going to continue to fund this, and the local government is going to be encouraged to pick up loans from this based on these indicators. So that's broadly what he talks to us about. He talks to us about how the priority of for 2021 is also going to be, to keep broad macro indicators in a sort of a manageable range, focus on science and technology, focus on new infrastructure, focus on opening up, focus on domestic demand. And doing all of this, he set certain targets, like say for 2021, he wants to create 11 million new jobs, keep surveyed unemployment rate, which is again only urban unemployment rate, to 5.5%, expand grain output, keep energy consumption to a certain degree, and so on and so forth. So all these details he shares in his work report. The last interesting thing that I would want to point you towards is that he talks about expanding urbanization. Now, this is really, really interesting, right? I mean, at the end of the 5-year plan, the Chinese are essentially looking at expanding urbanization to 65% of the population, which is quite significant, right? This currently urbanization in China is about 60%. If you want to get to 65%, that means that every year from this year onwards till 2025, at least 10 million people will be moving to urban centers. In China, because you have the hukou system by which you get certain specific urban registration, you don't, a lot of people who are living in urban centers, around 400 million people, are migrants who don't necessarily have household registration in these cities. So therefore, they don't have access to public services like public education, public healthcare, and so on and so forth. And that's a real challenge. Now, he's talking about some degree of reform of the hukou system also. So Li Keqiang talks about the government is essentially in sort of next plan. It's talking about how cities with 3 to 5 million people as population will loosen the residency requirements, while mega cities with a population of more than 5 million will introduce a points-based system depending on your length of stay in the city and so on and so forth, your social security payment record, to determine whether you can actually get that urban residency. Now, this to me is a massive reform because it will change the political economy of cities. It will also require local governments to receive much more money from the central government. So I presume that as this process takes place, you will actually see some degree of changes in also how taxation is disbursed between local and central governments. Central government controls the purse strings, but I think you're going to see some changes because all of this burden is going to go on local governments, city governments, and so on and so forth. So I think you're going to see some of this change. How this gets worked out is again something to be seen. But to me, these are some of the significant things that he spoke about.
Fair enough. Very comprehensive, Manoj. So now, Manoj, also during Li Keqiang's speech, he mentioned briefly about defense expenditure and what China is going to do about its defense spending in this year, right?
He doesn't really talk about the defense expenditure. He briefly talks about armed forces reform and, the PLA in general, where he talks about how, we will thoroughly implement Xi Jinping's thinking on strengthening the armed forces and the military strategy and so on and so forth, and maintain political control over the armed forces, the party's control. So he doesn't speak about defense in the speech, but there are three documents, like I said, which came out immediately as this happened on March 5th. There was Li Keqiang's speech, there was the NDRC's document, and then there was the budget document, the draft budget. The draft budget documents gives you details about the defense spending. Now, to be fair, I haven't necessarily gone through the entire draft budget document. I need to actually look at that in detail. The reason that I say that is because it will also give you a hint at what internal security spending is like. And that's something that's important to note, because over the last, particularly the last 5-7 years, internal security spending has been much higher than defense spending. So that's something to keep in mind. And that has a lot of that money goes into Xinjiang and Tibet. And I presume that is going to continue. But going forward, what we understand is that China's defense budget is going to be increased by 6.8% this year. What's important about that is that it's obviously much higher than what you expect your annual GDP growth. So if your annual GDP growth expectation is 6%, your defense budget growth you're expecting at 6.8%. That would take China's defense spending for the year officially to well over 200 billion US dollars, over 209 billion dollars. And that's the first time that it's hit that level. Again, if you compare it from an Indian defense spending point of view, you can see the gap in itself. The objective, of course, for this is that from a Chinese point of view, the external threat perception continues to remain very, very high. Primarily, if you look at it from the point of view of not just your Western sort of borders with India, where last year, as we all know, all that has happened, but also on your eastern flank with Taiwan, the stress that Beijing feels with regard to Taiwan. Even with Trump gone, now Joe Biden in, you're seeing movement on the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. You're seeing Biden in his initial sort of weeks in office talking to the Japanese and committing, committing to the defense, the Senkakus, which Trump was sort of wishy-washy about. So you're also seeing other countries in Europe talking about an Indo-Pacific policy. So I think there's a deep sense of threat perception, and therefore you're going to see defense spending go up. At the same time, this threat perception is not only limited to China's periphery, but it's also expanded to sort of, the Indian Ocean region, Belt and Road, so you're going to see this money being spent further. Again, we need to see how this breakdown happens. And Suyash, I'm sure over the period of the year, you and I will talk about this much more in terms of where this money is going, whether it's going in creating new equipment, whether it's going in maintaining equipment, whether it's going in manpower. That's the kind of breakdown that we don't have right now, but that's something to look forward to.
Okay. And finally, Manoj, also simultaneously, Wang Yi gave his annual press conference where he was asked about different issues with different countries. If I can remember correctly, Russia, India, and US. These were the broad questions. These were the broad country-related questions which he was asked about. So, what can you tell us about that?
So again, this is a sort of part of normal process during the NPC. A lot of ministers across the board come out and give press conferences. It's not just the foreign minister or the premier, but a lot of ministers speak. And Li Keqiang will give a presser. Usually, that's what happens at the end of the NPC, which is on March 11th. What Wang Yi spoke about, again, he reiterated a lot of things that were common that he's said in the past. I mean, some of the things that to me were interesting, and I noted them in my breakdown that I did of the People's Daily. He talked about, China's major country diplomacy during COVID-19 and what all the country has done in terms of its external engagement. Again, other reports, if you want more details on this, I mean, the NDRC document does a great job of providing incredible detail to, how many masks were produced in January last year, February last year to April last year, how many were exported, which countries they were exported to, and a lot of that. So I really recommend people who want to follow what China is doing to go and actually take a look at that document. It's really, really detailed. I mean, I'll give you an example from it, right? The NDRC document tells us that, as becoming one of the biggest suppliers of epidemic prevention material, China provided more than 200 countries with 220 billion face masks, 2.3 billion protective gowns, and 1 billion testing kits. Again, you can see, you can question all of this stuff, but this is the data that they are putting out there, and I think it's important for people to go through the actual data from the government in terms of what they are saying, of what they have done, because it's a really useful resource. But yeah, getting back to Wang Yi, he sort of talked up about this was more about rhetoric, right? He talked up China's sort of engagement internationally. To me, what's interesting in that question when he answered that about, what is the biggest thing that you have done in 2020, he began not with COVID-19, but he began with talking about defending national interests and security. So this is, I'm going to quote him. He said, "We stood firm against hegemony, high-handedness, and bullying, and rejected outright interference in China's domestic affairs. China's sovereignty is not to be infringed upon, and dignity of the Chinese nation is not to be trifled with." Now, to me, this tells you that his priority, signaling his priority, is the relationship with the US, because he then also talks about unilateralism and so on and so forth. With regard to Russia, it was probably the most positive message that he had to send out, where he talked about how, China and Russia will set an example of strategic mutual trust going forward. To me, it's still surprising that, and this tells you a little bit about Beijing's anxieties. He talks about how China and Russia will jointly oppose color revolutions and counter disinformation. It just tells you a little bit about how they continue to be worried about their sort of frontier regions, Xinjiang and Tibet in particular, Hong Kong also, of course, in this context, because they also labeled the protest movements in Hong Kong an attempt at a color revolution. So I think that's something to be kept in mind. He spoke about Europe, and he talked about, again, these are all on-point Beijing messages. He talked about how, because the question with regard to Europe was asked in the context of US-Europe relationship and Biden's attempt to build a transatlantic sort of front with regard to China. Although it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but that's what the question was essentially about. And his answer was that, look, Europe is an important player in a multipolar world, and we believe in strengthened strategic autonomy for Europe, which is basically code to tell Europe that, look, you need to make your own decisions, and we can't see you siding with the Americans in that sense. So again, interesting there. With regard to India, there was a specific question. Last year at the NPC, there was no question on India. And if you, like I said, NPC last year was happening in late May. So the standoff in Eastern Ladakh had already started. This year, there was a question while this disengagement is going on in Eastern Ladakh. And he spoke about how India and China are each other's friends and not rivals. And, I'm again going to quote him. He says, "The two sides need to help each other succeed instead of undercutting each other. Great advice. I wish Beijing would take it with regard to the NSG and UN Security Council reform." He talked about intensifying cooperation and not harboring suspicion of each other. Again, on the boundary dispute, I don't think any of this is going to be new to Indian listeners, but it also tells you about Beijing's attitude. He talked about the boundary dispute being an issue left over from history, and saying that it's not the whole story of the India-China relationship, saying that it's important to manage the dispute properly while also enhancing cooperation to create enabling conditions for the settlement of the issue. Again, this is standard Beijing's line, where it talks about the fact that, keep the boundary dispute in one context and let's continue with the rest of the issue, which is something that India has basically said no to in this last year, where it said, no, you can't have tensions at the boundary while have the relationship function as normal. Again, he spoke about, and again, I'm quoting Wang Yi, "The rights and wrongs of what happened in the border area last year are clear. So are the stakes involved. What happened again proves that initiating confrontation will not solve the problem, and that returning to peaceful negotiation is the right way forward. China's position is very clear. We're committed to settling the boundary dispute through dialogue and consultation." So I think this is a bit of, again, something that doesn't fit well from an Indian point of view, because I don't know, when Wang Yi says the rights and wrongs are clear, I don't think it's clear, and I really wish that he would take his own advice. But yeah, I mean, it's a much more positive message than we've heard in the last year. And I think let's see how the disengagement plays out, how things play out. I think nobody in India will be reading that and saying that, there's a change of approach from Beijing. It seems like they are largely sticking to their point. The last point that I want to talk about is from his press conference again, is, the idea that he's again hit on the issue of, how there should be no ideological conflict. Countries should be allowed to choose their own systems, which again, I mean, Beijing puts it in this way, but actually it is challenging the status quo of things like universal declarations of human rights and things like that, because it wants to redefine some of these models while saying that, you can't impose one model on the rest of the world. And then lastly, he talks about, from a journalistic point of view, since Suyash, both you and I have been part of the media, he talks about giving advice to foreign media and says that China hopes to welcome more Edgar Snows of this new era among foreign journalists. Of course, Edgar Snow was the gentleman who wrote that biography with regard to Mao, and that sort of propelled this. That was one of those sort of big success stories of the Communist Party with regard to sort of discourse power very, very early on, because of how Edgar Snow portrayed Mao and the Communist Party in his book. And I think that is something that, he's talking about, sort of maybe more red stars over China is what we're going to see going forward. But I think that's the party is telling foreign media what it expects of them. And what it expects is largely for them to toe the party line. So it's going to be a testy relationship with foreign media within China.
Yeah, clearly, Manoj, you and I have taken journalism lectures from different universities than Wang Yi. Clearly, on that note, let us conclude this episode. Thank you, Manoj, for such a elaborate discussion on what is happening under the current NPC. If you guys like our China analysis, Manoj writes a weekly newsletter called Eye on China. He also does a daily blog on People's Daily. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Siet. We really do appreciate your support. We have a new show on the network. It's called The Fighting Goat, and if you love fighting sports, tune in every Wednesday with hosts Arjun and Somesh. They also featured, by the way, on Cyrus Says this week, where the three fitness freaks bonded over their love for TV sports and sports in general. Tune in to This Round Is On Me, where Gauri celebrated her 25th anniversary with Kavita Rajwade, who is my co-founder at the IVM Podcast Network. They give us details about how this show was curated, and they talk about podcasts in general. On The Habit Coach, Ashton highlighted our addiction to screens, how we are glued to either a big laptop screen or a small mobile screen all day. He shared some tips on how to rectify this unhealthy lifestyle. On All Things Policy, Anirudh Kanisati spoke to Pratik Vakre and Rohan Sheth about the new internet guidelines that were issued by the Government of India recently and their impact on content creators and platforms. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik invited Vivek Ram, who is a celebrated animation artist. They chatted about his stint with animation and starting his own studio called Vanar Sena, bringing to life stories from ancient India and his scriptures with animation as his vehicle. We had Dhanya Rajendran, the editor of the News Minute, on the Note with Maruk Inayat. It was a deep dive into the digital newsroom and the upkeep of truth in a fake news pandemic. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Feeling overwhelmed, anxious, struggling with too many obstacles, don't know where your life is headed? Well, if you are dealing with one or all of these, tune into the Positively Unlimited podcast, because in each episode, I share a life lesson, a life hack, a pro tip that can help you get your life back on track. All episodes are available on the IBM website, IBM Podcast app, or wherever it is that you get your podcast from.